The fear of radiation is primal because it's invisible, silent, and kills in ways the human mind struggles to comprehend. On April 26, 1986, that invisible terror became devastatingly real when Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant exploded, releasing more radioactive material into the atmosphere than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. What makes Chernobyl uniquely terrifying isn't just the scale of the catastrophe, but the cascade of human error, institutional denial, and technological hubris that transformed a routine safety test into the worst nuclear disaster in history. For those in the control room, the first hours were marked by confusion and disbelief. Their instruments told them the reactor core was intact even as radiation alarms screamed and pieces of reactor fuel lay scattered around the facility. For those living nearby, the initial hours passed in ignorant normalcy, children playing outside while invisible particles settled into their lungs, their bodies absorbing doses that would kill them slowly over weeks and months. Understanding how Chernobyl unfolded hour by hour reveals not just a technical failure but a psychological collapse where trained professionals couldn't accept what their senses told them, where institutional pressure to deny reality overrode survival instinct, where the gap between what was happening and what people could believe was happening created a delay that cost thousands of lives. The disaster began at 1:23 a.m. with a safety test meant to determine whether the reactor's turbines could produce enough electricity to power the water pumps during a power failure. The test had been delayed, leaving the reactor operating at low power for hours, a condition that created dangerous instability in the RBMK reactor design. Operators disabled multiple safety systems to conduct the test, believing they were following procedures that would demonstrate safety margins. Instead, they created conditions where the reactor's fundamental design flaws would become catastrophically apparent. The psychology in the control room was focused confidence bordering on complacency. These were experienced operators conducting what they believed was routine. The decision to disable safety systems didn't feel reckless because they trusted their understanding of how the reactor worked and believed they could control the test parameters. This confidence was built on years of operating without major incident, on the Soviet nuclear program's reputation for engineering excellence, on the psychological comfort that comes from familiarity with complex systems. At 1:23:40 a.m., reactor power began spiking uncontrollably. The operators hit the emergency shutdown button, expecting control rods to drop into the reactor core and halt the chain reaction. Instead, due to a fundamental design flaw in the RBMK reactor, inserting the control rods actually increased reactivity for several seconds before they could dampen it. In those seconds, power output surged to approximately 33,000 megawatts, 10 times normal operating power. The fuel rods ruptured, water coolant flashed to steam, and the resulting steam explosion blew the 2,000-ton concrete and steel lid off the reactor core. The control room transformed from confident control to shocked incomprehension in seconds. When instruments showed impossible readings and the building shook with explosive force, their minds struggled to process what happened. The psychological defense mechanism of denial immediately activated. This couldn't be happening. The reactor couldn't have exploded. The readings must be wrong. A second explosion followed, scattering highly radioactive debris across the facility. Pieces of reactor fuel and graphite moderator lay exposed, emitting lethal radiation doses while a plume of radioactive material rose into the night sky. In the hours following the explosion, a dangerous psychological phenomenon took hold. The control room's radiation detectors maxed out at 3.6 Roentgens per hour, serious but manageable. What operators didn't know was that actual radiation levels were thousands of times higher. Their instruments simply couldn't measure beyond maximum range. This technical limitation combined with psychological denial to create a false narrative. The reactor was damaged but intact. Radiation was elevated but contained. The situation was serious but manageable. The psychology of denial was reinforced by every structural factor. Admitting the reactor exploded meant admitting impossible failure, meant taking responsibility for catastrophic consequences, meant facing criminal prosecution and personal destruction. The human mind, when faced with unbearable reality, will grasp at any alternative explanation. The operators convinced themselves that readings were malfunctioning. That damage was less severe than it appeared, that the core was still mostly intact beneath damaged structures. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov embodied this denial most dramatically. Despite evidence of explosion, despite witnesses reporting pieces of reactor core on the ground, despite radiation readings indicating core exposure, he insisted the reactor was intact and ordered personnel to attempt emergency cooling procedures that assumed structural integrity. His psychological state combined professional pride, fear of consequences, and genuine inability to accept what was happening. Plant personnel experienced surreal disconnection between what they witnessed and what they were told. They saw a destroyed building, graphite fires burning on exposed surfaces, colleagues vomiting from radiation sickness, yet were ordered to continue operations as though damage was minor. This cognitive dissonance created paralysis. Trust the instruments and orders, or trust your senses and survival instinct? The first responders, firefighters who arrived to battle graphite fires, entered this hell of denial without protective equipment or understanding of the radiation they were absorbing. They fought fires on the reactor roof, shoveling pieces of radioactive graphite emitting thousands of Roentgens per hour. Doses sufficient to cause acute radiation syndrome within minutes. As dawn approached, the gap between reality and official narrative began narrowing. But institutional denial fought every step of acknowledgement. Plant management had informed Soviet authorities that an accident occurred but critically minimized its severity. The official report to Moscow stated that the reactor was damaged, but radiation was within manageable limits, a catastrophic understatement born from psychological denial combined with Soviet culture of never admitting major failures. The psychology during these hours involved hierarchical information filtering where each level of bureaucracy minimized the disaster in reports upward, partly from genuine uncertainty but largely from institutional fear of delivering catastrophic news. In Soviet culture, bearing bad news was dangerous for the messenger. Each official had personal incentive to interpret information optimistically, to emphasize control and minimize severity, to avoid being the one who reported that Soviet technology had catastrophically failed. By morning, radiation measurements from more sensitive equipment began revealing the true scale. Physicists who understood nuclear physics recognized that the readings they were seeing were only possible if the reactor core was exposed and burning. Their psychological burden was knowing the truth while watching officials deny it. Understanding that thousands in nearby Pripyat were being exposed to dangerous radiation while authorities delayed evacuation. Seeing the disaster clearly while being unable to force acknowledgement from those with power to respond. These hours created a strange dual reality. Inside the plant, personnel were dying from radiation exposure, vomiting, developing burns, showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. Outside in Pripyat, families woke to a normal Saturday. Children went outside to play. People went about weekend activities while invisible contamination settled over the city. The cognitive dissonance between these two realities, catastrophe and normalcy separated by a few kilometers, was maintained by information control and denial. The firefighters who battled the initial blaze were now in hospital exhibiting severe radiation sickness, their skin blistering, vomiting continuously, immune systems collapsing. By afternoon of April 26th, denial was finally giving way to acceptance among Soviet leadership that this was a disaster requiring massive response. The decision to evacuate Pripyat came roughly 18 hours after the explosion. 18 hours during which 50,000 residents absorbed radiation that would cause long-term health consequences. The delay was pure product of psychological and institutional denial, of reluctance to take action that would confirm the severity, of hope that somehow the situation would stabilize without requiring such dramatic measures. The psychology of evacuation was managed denial. Officials told residents this was temporary, that they would return in 3 days, that they should leave possessions behind. This framing was partly to prevent panic but also reflected continued unwillingness to fully accept that Pripyat was now uninhabitable. Residents, trusting official guidance, left with minimal belongings, leaving behind pets and possessions, believing they'd be back shortly. The emotional experience of evacuation was therefore muted. Concern rather than terror, inconvenience rather than loss, because the truth was still being withheld. At the reactor, the situation was worsening. The exposed core was burning at temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius, continuing to release massive amounts of radioactive material. The graphite fire was feeding on the reactor's moderator, creating a self-sustaining blaze that would burn for days, continuously pumping radiation into the air. Scientists who fully understood the disaster were approaching panic, recognizing that if the molten core burned through the concrete pad into water reservoirs below, a steam explosion could destroy the remaining reactors and create an even larger catastrophe. The days following the explosion saw extraordinary acts of heroism alongside continued institutional dysfunction. Helicopter pilots flew hundreds of sorties over the exposed reactor core, dropping sand, boron, dolomite, and lead to smother the fire and absorb radiation. These pilots absorbed massive radiation doses with each flight, knowing they were sacrificing their health and likely their lives to prevent an even larger catastrophe. The psychology of this heroism was complex. Duty, pressure, genuine desire to prevent further disaster, and perhaps denial about their own exposure levels. The most famous act of heroism came when 3 volunteers, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov, dove into flooded corridors beneath the reactor to open drainage valves, preventing the molten core from reaching water reservoirs and causing a catastrophic steam explosion. They waded through chest-deep radioactive water in near darkness, knowing they were likely receiving lethal doses to complete a mission that potentially saved millions of lives by preventing a secondary explosion that would have devastated a much wider area. The emotional landscape of Chernobyl in these first 72 hours was one of delayed comprehension catching up to instant catastrophe. What took seconds to destroy took hours and days for human minds and institutions to accept. The gap between explosion and understanding, between reality and acknowledgement, between what happened and what could be believed to have happened, created a disaster within the disaster where appropriate responses were delayed by psychological and institutional inability to process the unprecedented. By the time full truth was accepted, hundreds had received doses that would kill them within weeks. Thousands had been exposed to contamination that would cause cancers for decades, and an entire region had been rendered uninhabitable for generations. Not just because of the explosion, but because of the hours of denial that prevented protective action when it could have mattered most.